I think it's a mistake to imagine that the majority of the members of the WTO actually support WTO agreements. Most of them have no idea what's taking place behind the closed doors where the few power players, they're called the Quad, it's the EU, the United States, Japan, and Canada of all things, actually work out these deals. I've been to GATT meetings where developing countries show up at NGO briefings because that's the best access they have to what's happening in the real negotiations. And even within the governments of the power players, there's no public support for this agenda. These governments have done everything they can do to frustrate informed public debate about these issues. But the last thing I'll say is this. This isn't an agenda that was crafted by governments. It's an agenda crafted by the world's largest corporations, operating through a handful of trade bureaucrats that don't even consult within their own governmental systems about the sellout of sovereignty and every other social policy objective to the trade ambitions of the world's largest corporations. That's what this agenda is about.
If I might ask you a question, and that is as we struggle, those of us who are concerned about the protections of the environment and protections of worker rights within the WTO at all, very often, and the paper that you presented us today points to this fact out, very often when we see the efforts of campesinos to organize, or an environmental community to organize, or workers to organize, they immediately encounter the full force and impact of the state against those efforts. And I see others nodding their head here on the table, that they send in the military or the police or the judicial system and others to disband those efforts to organize. And yet we're told constantly that as economies mature and as trade relations mature, that this will naturally come. So far in Mexico, this really hasn't come. We've seen it in a number of the states where efforts have been made to try to organize around the environment, around workers' rights, around campesinos, around subsistence farming. And I just wondered if you'd like to elaborate on that point with respect from the Mexican point of view.
I'm not sure if I understood your question, but the situation is in Mexico that it's very different, the legal framework at the reality. Has also in WTO, the government speak about the necessity to include rules, very good rules for development and so on. It's totally different, the speech and the reality. It's a great contradiction also in the case of worker rights, farmer rights, or elementary rights, and the reality. Give me only one example is the last week in Mexico was Mary Robinson, the High Commissioner of the Human Rights. First time in Mexico to observe what is the deeply threatening of the human rights in Mexico. That we have with the United States and Canada, even under NAFTA, the right to defend the labor rights and the human rights, and now with the European Union. But the reality is the constant violation of the human rights. That I think that the people have the right to defend the elementary rights, with or without any kind of framework.
Thank you. Maxine?
Capaz to basically eliminate the intellectual property rights problem. It's amazing. In Africa and other developing countries, countries in Africa and other developing countries, the people depend on plants for their medicine, for their religious rites, all kinds of things, but particularly for medicine. These plants and some animals are being claimed by multinational corporations who are developing these plants for all kinds of products. And the indigenous people, the people of these countries, then don't have a right to use these plants for their own necessary use. And what we're finding in South Africa, for example, where there's a growing AIDS problem, that the pharmaceuticals, US pharmaceuticals, are denying the South Africans the use of certain generic medicines that are developed through their own plants because they say it is a violation of their patent rights guaranteed to them by WTO. Would you please explain how this has developed in the WTO? What does this mean?
Okay. Can I go? Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to, first of all, that's true, you know, a lot of the medicinal, that's one of the main problems of indigenous peoples with the WTO, the WTO allowing the patenting of these plants, microorganism, animals, and even the genetic resources, the DNA of indigenous peoples. This is taking place in a lot of countries where the DNA is collected and they patent it because they see some medicinal profits, profits that will come up when they develop this as medicines. The way they do it in the WTO is because the definition that they have in the Article 27.3b of TRIPS agreement says that while animals and plants cannot be patented, microorganisms can be patented, should be patented, and the microbiological and non-biological processes of developing plants and animals are also patentable. And therefore, the net effect of all this is that everything can actually be patentable, not just the plants, but even the parts of the plants and the processes in which these plants are being produced are also patentable. And that is what they are patenting now. The pharmaceutical companies, the biotechnology companies, they are patenting these processes because that is allowed by the WTO. And that is why the indigenous people statement, which came out against this, says that we would like the WTO to remove the distinction between microorganisms and plants and animals because all of these are living things. And for indigenous peoples, living things are sacred. Secondly, we would like them to remove that distinction between non-biological and microbiological processes because these are all processes of producing life, and the process of producing life is sacred in whichever way it is. So therefore, the WTO should not legitimize the patenting of these life forms and the appropriation of the pharmaceuticals of the rights over these plants, medicines, and animals. And this is really the key issue that indigenous peoples have, and we look forward to really having the support of the legislators, the parliamentarians, to push for this revision of the agreement in the WTO negotiations this week. Okay.
Let me again thank our panel for their participation and for their insights and their...
Buenas tardes, compañeras y compañeros.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, brothers and sisters.
Bueno, siempre ser la primera como que da un poco de nervios, pero aquí estamos.
Let me start by saying that I'm a little nervous, but here we go.
Lo primero que quiero hacer es ponerlos un poco en contexto del lugar donde yo vengo. Yo fui trabajadora de la maquiladora o Zonas Francas durante 10 años.
The first thing I'd like to do is give a little context from where I'm coming. I'm a worker in the maquiladores.
Y en la zona fronteriza de México con Estados Unidos hace más de 30 años que estamos viviendo este proceso de libre comercio.
In the border zone of Mexico, in the border zone between Mexico and the United States, we've been in this process of maquiladoras for the past 30 years.
Entonces, después de que Estados Unidos terminó el programa que tenían, que no te escucha. Después de que terminó el programa de braceros de México con Estados Unidos, necesitaban poner a trabajar a todos los hombres que estaban repatriando a México.
When the Bracero program ended 30 years ago, there was a need to give employment to all of the men that were returning to Mexico from the United States.
Y la maravilla que se les ocurrió para esto fue instalar maquiladoras en la frontera.
And the best way that they considered to do this was to create the maquiladora system in the border zone.
Se suponía que estas plantas iban a dar trabajo a todos los hombres que estaban regresando de los Estados Unidos.
¿Puede repetir? Perdón?
Okay. Que las maquiladoras les iban a dar trabajo a los Estados Unidos.
And does this work? Can people hear me? Yeah. Okay. And it was understood that the best way to provide employment for these people was to create the maquiladoras in the border zone of Mexico.
La realidad fue que estas plantas solamente contrataban mujeres.
But it turned out that they were only giving employment to women.
Y el pretexto es que nosotras somos más dóciles y mejores para hacer este tipo de trabajo.
And the pretext is that women are supposedly more docile and easier to make them do the work.
Y en relación a la salud que se está viviendo en la frontera a consecuencia de la instalación de maquiladoras,
And the situation that people are having to live with after the installation of maquiladoras in the border zone.
tan solo en mi ciudad hay 450 de estas fábricas. Que hay 450 fábricas en Juárez.
So now there are 450 maquiladora factories in Mexico. No, they started with 450. ¿Que empezaron con 450?
No, hay ahorita.
Ahorita. There are now 450 in Mexico.
Que le está dando empleo aproximadamente a 125,000 trabajadoras y trabajadores.
That employs approximately 125,000 workers.
La mayoría de ellas, el 55% ahorita son mujeres.
The majority of them, 65% of them, are women.
Esto ha traído como consecuencia que en estas zonas fronterizas haya mucha migración.
¿Perdón?
No escuchas, que tengamos mucha migración de otros estados.
There's a lot of immigration from other Mexican states to the border zone.
Okay. Este ha traído problemas de falta de salud hacia las trabajadoras y los trabajadores,
One of the major problems are health problems,
problemas de vivienda,
a lack of housing,
problemas de falta de guarderías donde poder cuidar a los niños.
a lack of childcare to take care of the children while women are working.
Una problemática muy fuerte es la violencia hacia las mujeres,
And a very serious problem is violence against women,
donde se vive discriminación,
where they suffer discrimination,
acoso sexual
sexual harassment,
y también aunque se tengan el mismo empleo, se paga diferente entre hombres y mujeres.
and even though they do the same work, women receive less wages than male workers.
Otra de las cosas, en la frontera la mayoría de las mujeres son las que atienden las casas, son jefas de familia.
Another problem is the fact that many of the women workers in the maquiladoras are also they're providers for the homes, for the families.
Igual que con la traducción va a ser el mismo tiempo.
Is there extra time because of the translation? Okay, sí, hay más tiempo.
Okay. Hace ya algunos años hemos tenido problemas fuertes con violencia física. En Ciudad Juárez tenemos ahorita 198 mujeres asesinadas brutalmente y violadas.
We've also seen a terrible problem with violence in Ciudad Juárez, for example. There have been 128 women who have been murdered.
Estas son las problemáticas que está ocasionando estos tratados comerciales cuando no se consulta a las mujeres y a los hombres que viven en los países.
This is the result of a system that doesn't consult the men and women who work in these factories.
Pero también nosotros como grupos organizados hemos estado luchando por más de 30 años con este tipo de tratados comerciales.
But we're also organized, and we've been fighting these free trade agreements for the past 30 years.
Y mientras ellos firman tratados comerciales, nosotros estamos firmando tratados de libre solidaridad con los grupos de todos los grupos de diferentes países.
And at the same time that they're signing these free trade agreements, we're signing free organizing agreements so that workers from different countries can work together.
Y hemos logrado vencer algunas cosas tan peligrosas como un cementerio nuclear que quisieron establecer en Sierra Blanca, Texas.
And we've had some victories like stopping a nuclear reservation in the Sierra Blanca Mountains.
Que fue una lucha de las comunidades de los dos países en la frontera.
There was a fight that was waged by the communities on both sides of the border.
Y estamos luchando para que nosotros como organizaciones, como grupos de redes de justicia ambiental, estamos luchando porque el medio ambiente no solamente sean defender a los árboles o los bosques.
And we're fighting in these many environmental organizations, not just for the trees and the forests,
Sino integrar todo esto a la vida cotidiana de los hombres y las mujeres.
but to integrate this ecology into the daily life of men and women.
Para nosotros el ambiente es donde vivimos, trabajamos, estudiamos, jugamos y amamos.
For us, the environment is the place where we live, we work, we study, we play, and we love.
Y tenemos que luchar unidas y unidos para tener una vida mejor para las futuras generaciones.
And we all have to fight together for a better future.
Y no debemos permitir que la OMC esté destrozando los pueblos enteros del tercer mundo
And we can't allow the WTO to destroy the peoples of the third world.
y de muchos del primer mundo.
And many of the peoples of the first world also.
Entonces debemos oponernos a esto y no dejar pasar estos tratados que son tan inhumanos para todos y todas.
And so we all have to oppose these agreements that are being made in a few hands that affect all of us.
Gracias.
Thank you.
I'm involved as a consultant in the World Trade Organization asbestos case as a technical consultant for the European Commission, which is defending France's right to ban asbestos. I am not speaking on behalf of anyone but myself, however, here today. This case is a challenge by Canada to... pardon? Oh. Right. Shame on Canada for that. And it really is kind of a disgrace. You got to wonder when you see Canada bringing this case whether the only difference between landmines and asbestos mines is what Canada exports. And I think that the people in Canada would be horrified if they knew more about this case. This case has received almost no political coverage in the media in Canada. And yet this is a case initiated by Canada to try and overturn the ban on asbestos by France. There are about a dozen European countries that have banned asbestos. The European Union has decided to go for a ban on asbestos in all of its countries by the year 2005. And Canada, which is trying to market asbestos mainly in the third world, is trying desperately to stop the Europeans from going through with these bans and continuing them because it's going to hurt business in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Now, the argument that Canada uses is that controlled use of asbestos, that is, regulations to control asbestos in the environment, to protect the consumer and the worker, are sufficient, so that you can go on building houses out of asbestos cement panels and having people chopping into those walls and drilling through them all the time. And if you've got nice regulations published in the Federal Register of your country, that's going to somehow automatically protect all the workers and inhabitants in all those buildings from anybody doing anything improper and creating a lot of asbestos dust, which is going to cause a lot of people to get cancer. This is the argument, that controlled use is okay, and they're trying to overturn the French ban on the argument that controlled use is good enough to render the remaining hazards undetectable. Now, this is so outrageous that the world's biggest cheerleader for free trade, the United States government, has even opposed Canada in this case. The United States has said that it is the right of each nation to determine the acceptable degree of risk for citizens in its own territory. This position is, in my opinion, explained by the fact that there isn't a single multinational corporation based in the United States that gives a damn what happens to the asbestos industry. And so therefore, because of the fact that there are companies that are basically uninsurable for using asbestos anymore, and therefore asbestos use has diminished to 3% of its peak amount in the United States, notwithstanding industry overturning the EPA ban, this is where we are in the United States. Hardly any of it is used. Now, asbestos causes 1 death by cancer per hour in the United States. Its main use, as I said, is in building panels, asbestos cement pipes, and vehicle brakes, all of which are substitutable uses. Now, Canada exports 97% of all the asbestos they mine. It's not like controlled use of asbestos has been sold very well in Canada, where the workers are scared to death of this stuff. Most of it is exported. What credibility does anybody have talking about controlled use of asbestos? As I say, governments across Europe have banned it, and we in public health have fought hard for these national bans, only to wake up to the fact that we have this appeal of world government in the form of the World Trade Organization to sustain these bans. So strictly, legally speaking, the case is about the French ban, but in fact, it's about the third world. That's the real target of this case. And you've got to wonder if they can argue that controlled use is okay in France, when in real fact the case is about the use of asbestos in the third world, where controlled use of asbestos is totally out of the question in terms of what really happens. You've got to wonder what's wrong with the World Trade Organization deciding a case on such narrow terms and not really seeing what this case is really about and judging it on the basis of what this case is really about. A decision in the case is expected early in the year 2000. The entire dispute mechanism in this case is secret. All the comments are secret. They're choosing scientific experts. I can't tell you the names of the scientists. I can't say anything about the comments that have been received by the World Trade Organization about the possible bias of any of the scientists. And the comments of the scientists in response to the questions by the World Trade Organization, comments on their bias by the parties in the case, like the European Commission and Canada. None of this is publicly disclosable. There are going to be hearings on this in January in Geneva before the World Trade Organization. The media are not allowed to attend. Unions are not allowed to attend. Non-governmental organizations are not allowed to attend. Comments have been sent in to the World Trade Organization by the AFL-CIO and the Ban Asbestos Network in France. Those comments do not have to be considered at all by the World Trade Organization according to the rules of the WTO. The decisions in these cases are actually made by the staff members of the World Trade Organization. They appoint a panel of 3 people who are supposed to be judges. These are trade diplomats who don't even know how to pronounce public health. They don't read these thick documents of technical issues that come into them, and the technical questions that are sent out to the scientists who are supposed to advise the panel are all developed by the faceless bureaucrats within the staff of the World Trade Organization, who are all economists and people trained in political science. They're not scientists, doctors, and engineers. They don't understand the technical issues involved in these cases, and they probably get some help in writing their decisions from the business interests that aren't involved in these cases, who can take them out to the best restaurants in Geneva and explain some of these things to them during their time when they're not sitting in the office. All of this would probably be allowed because the litigants in these cases are governments, and the companies, which may be using the governments as their front men, are technically speaking, I suppose, free to contact the people in the World Trade Organization and get them to, understand the issues the way the companies want the issues understood. So I guess the critique, when it boils down, is that this is something that's going on in complete secrecy, and there's complete lack of access to any kind of democratic control, any kind of accountability to consider things like environmental issues, to listen to environmental groups and trade unions, and the stakes are really too high for all of us who care about our health, our environment, the poor and the excluded, to let this go on uncontrolled.
From Ghana, representing Friends of the Earth. Welcome.
I would like in the first place to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak on this panel. I would like to look at the human health impacts of mining as a result of trade and investment liberalization under the regime of the WTO. This I will do using empirical evidence from Ghana, basically based on some work done by Friends of the Earth. The world trading system under the regime of the WTO seeks to promote free movement of goods, services, and capital. This the WTO does in the name of trade and investment liberalization. Structural adjustment programs under the auspices of the World Bank and the IMF has already worked to the detriment of the people in most developing economies. The situation has been exacerbated by the liberalization policies of the WTO, which has seen massive investment into the extractive sectors of a number of developing countries, including Ghana. The mining sector of Ghana is a typical case in point. Being one of the most hazardous sectors in the world, the mining boom has come with serious health consequences. These consequences can be either direct or indirect. I will just highlight on a few of these health consequences of mining. An indirect impact of mining relating to human health is that of social displacement, since mining needs large tracts of land. And basically, the communities in such mining communities are mostly agrarian, and as their lands are taken away, they lose their farmlands and their source of livelihood. This therefore brings food insecurity, malnutrition, and ill health of the people in such communities. The direct impact that I would like to look at relates to the effect of mining chemicals on the health of the people. Chemicals used in mining, such as cyanide, mercury, etc., are highly toxic. However, the WTO will be only interested in only the trade in such chemicals without making provision in its trade agreements to check the impact of such chemicals, or making provision for education of small miners, for instance, on the use of chemicals such as mercury. Empirical evidence show that a lot of small miners are poisoned from chemicals that they use in undertaking their activity. A study undertaken in northern Ghana, for instance, and also other mining communities, show that some people in such areas had skin pigmentation as a result of contact with some of these mining chemicals. Water pollution from mining is another case in point. More often than not, sources of drinking water of the people are polluted as a result of these mining activities. However, you realize that these powerful mining companies, most of the time, do not provide for alternative source of water for such people. And therefore, the people are compelled to depend on this polluted water, which affects their health. Another area of serious concern is that of area pollution, basically from dust and other atmospheric particulates in mining communities. Again, studies taken in Ghana in some mining communities show that a lot of patients at medical centers showed upper respiratory tract infections, and this rank high among the prevalent diseases in such areas. Another serious health impact that is associated with mining is that of noise pollution. In Ghana, for instance, the areas of concentration of mines are associated with high noise pollution due to vibration and blasting of mineral-bearing ores. There have been cases where nursing mothers have had to carry their babies at their backs as a result of blasting. If we are to internalize all these externalities resulting from mining as a result of investment in these areas due to high liberalization under the regime of the WTO, we will realize that the short-term gains derived by companies and governments could become negative. It is that essential that trade rules are reviewed to take into account these health problems associated with the sector. It is only when trade in these sectors is given the human face that we can attain sustainable societies. And that's why we are calling for a review of the WTO system now to take account of these problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I feel very privileged to be invited to this august gathering. I'm a medical doctor. I'm working in Pakistan, and I'm a partner of an international movement which is emerging at a very great speed for access to medicines. There are three important organizations which are leading from the front this movement, and here I represent one of those organizations which is called Health Action International, and the other two are Medicine Sans Frontier, which recently won Nobel Peace Prize for its efforts in developing countries, and the third organization is Consumer Project on Technology, which is an American organization. What is access to drugs? This means that if people do not have access in the time of their sickness and illness, their sickness can be prolonged and they can die. And it's not just an abstract notion. It is happening today all around the world in developing countries. While I am talking to you, people are actually practically dying because they are not getting medicines which are available in the markets, but they are out of reach to them because they do not have money to buy them. It's a very saddening scenario. we have been working to work out solutions with our governments in developing countries so that they can redouble their efforts to make essential treatments available to the people. Although the governments have meager resources, they are weak, they are sometimes corrupt, but they are also splintering under tremendous pressures from outside, pressures from international organizations like IMF, World Bank, which are telling them to privatize their social sectors, which includes health and education. And with so much less financing available for a sector like health, then came the WTO with its agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, which said that any new treatment which would be available in developing countries would be available at very high price for at least 20 years, which means that patents would be strengthened and prolonged for 20 years, which would mean that people would be further denied access to essential drugs. Now, this is obviously not acceptable, because if we accept that health is a basic human right, then there should be arrangements made available to the governments and within all such international agreements, which should be delivering such concessions, such exceptions, that if they are used, government should be able to make available those treatments to the people. And such provisions are available within TRIPS agreement to some extent. But then, many developed countries, driven by the capital interest, have actually exerted a lot of bilateral pressure on such governments in developing countries which have been trying to amend their laws to incorporate such exceptions and such provisions which would enable them to make such treatments available to the people. The case of South Africa recently has been very strongly illustrated this phenomena. I mean, in practical terms, what does a patent drug mean in terms of access? I give you just one example. There is an antiretroviral drug called fluconazole, which is patented in Kenya and which is not patented in Thailand. Hence, its price in Thailand is $0.2 per day, and its price in a poor country like Kenya is $20 per day. This is just one example, and there are many other examples. What we demand from this forum is that WTO, in its review process of TRIPS agreement, should look at all these issues, address to these issues, and establish an international working group which should work on these issues and help to improve this agreement so that essential treatments can be made available to the people. And secondly, we demand that WTO through its TRIPS Council should look at that what in last 5 years since WTO was born and this agreement was born, what it has achieved. I mean, the new Millennium Round is there's a lot of pressure for new negotiations without taking stock that how life has been made miserable, more miserable in the last 5 years due to implementation of this agreement in developing countries. I believe that if such concerns will not be taken into account by WTO and the negotiators, people would bury WTO finally. Unless enough concern is shown by WTO on these issues of human survival and of human life, people can change things. So better take into account these things and improve your system before people join hands across the globe, because globalization for people means solidarity across the globe, and it can change the things. Thank you very much.
We will now turn to questions and comments by the tribunal. Thank you very much for your statements, and we will begin with Mr. Bill Blakely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd first of all like to say to Mr. Castleman that I thank him for making clear the poverty of the position that the Canadian government has taken with respect to their request to the WTO to have a judgment on asbestos. And I personally hope, as one Canadian politician, that the judgment of the WTO will be that France has every right to regulate asbestos out of their environment. And I hope that the American position on asbestos will translate into similar positions on the right of the European Union not to have hormones in beef. But I would like to just follow up on something from a Canadian perspective on two things that have been mentioned. First of all, having to do with drug patent laws. Many of you may be aware that for many years in Canada we had a generic drug patent law which enabled drug companies to produce generic drugs very early on in the process, after only 18 months or 2 years after a new drug was created. And as a result of our government's capitulation to both NAFTA and the WTO, we now have come under that same regulation that you mentioned, the 20-year regulation. And so we've had a very drastic reduction in the ability of to provide cheap generic drugs to our population. The price of the new drugs is soaring, and it's putting a very great strain on our healthcare system. Which brings me to the second point that I wanted to make, which I think doesn't often come up in discussions of how the current drift of the WTO threatens health, and it may be a particular Canadian perspective, because as many of you know, particularly here in Seattle, not very far north of you, we have an entirely different kind of healthcare system, which is a single-payer, publicly funded. Healthcare system. It's not without its faults and not without its stresses, particularly as a result of fiscal cutbacks on the part of governments, etc. But in principle and in practice, still to a great degree, it's a good healthcare system, and it is in the sights, so to speak, of the American multinational healthcare corporations. They want to destroy it, and they will use the WTO to destroy it. Charlene Barshevsky has already said she wants a way of negotiating with respect to health care and education, to put health care and education on a plane where there will be more pressure to privatize, and where once you do begin to privatize, you won't be able to discriminate against foreign firms. And this is all part, from a Canadian point of view, of a larger plot, if you like. I think it is a plot, actually, to destroy the Canadian healthcare system as an example of what can be done when healthcare is designed on a not-for-profit basis. And what is happening at the WTO, or certainly what Ms. Barshevsky would like to happen, I'm not confident that she will get her way, but certainly what she would like to see happen is that the way will be opened for profit medicine to become the dominant paradigm for providing health care. It already is. There are islands where it isn't, and I think we should act to protect these islands, and that's what I'm certainly urging the Canadian government to do at these negotiations.
Thank you. Meghna?
Okay. We 130 biotechnology activists from 20 countries all over the world met in Seattle on Sunday, November 28, 1999, and agreed to the following actions: to keep biotechnology out of the WTO Ministerial Declaration and out of its future activities; to emphasize that biosafety protocol is the correct form to assess, regulate, and monitor the transfer of GMO and products thereafter; to support the African proposal to ban patents of living organisms and their parts; to institute a global ban on all genetically engineered processes, food, crops, and animals; to require complete labeling of all substances and processes, including GMOs, pesticides, to criminalize biopiracy and stealing of indigenous genes and knowledge of farmers, peasants, and indigenous peoples; to establish strict corporate liability for all economic loss and personal injury resulting from genetically engineered crops and food; to intensify our global campaign for organic agriculture and other forms of ecological farming; these biotechnology activists representing Australia, Austria, Brazil, Canada, Ecuador, France, Germany, India, Japan, Kenya, Korea, Malaysia, Nicaragua, Paraguay, South Africa, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom, and the United States. Is this reasonable?
Well, I will be very brief in my response. Not only that it is required, not only that it is reasonable, but it is required, and we should all demand that it should be excluded. All these things should be excluded from patenting all over the world, not just in developing countries, all over the world.
Thank you. For me, the statement is very essential, as it's a prerequisite for ensuring sustainable societies. If trade is to be mutually beneficial and local people are to have access to their own resources, then there is no way patents or living organisms should be patented. Again, looking at the health problems associated with chemical-based products, then I will go in for organic agriculture as is being proposed, as is safe health-wise and also environmentally sustainable. Thanks.
Estas propuestas de la gente que se reunió ayer, y yo creo que todas y todos tenemos que luchar para que no nos estén las grandes corporaciones no nos estén utilizando como
The proposal that was given by this group that met yesterday seems to me to be very important, and it's important that we do not allow ourselves
no nos utilicen para hacer este tipo de experimentos y que ahora los ancianos y las ancianas que antes utilizaban tantas plantas para curar, ahora tienen que pedir permiso a estas corporaciones para poder utilizar las plantas que ellos por siglos y siglos han utilizado.
We can't allow ourselves to be used in this grand experiment, and we can't allow our grandfathers and grandmothers who have been using these plants for millennia to be charged for the use today.
Okay, the other mic, that one. Okay. This is a question to the panel, and hopefully you can help me in my struggles in Washington with the administration and with many of my colleagues in Congress. I have been on the losing side, and I think the right side, of many of the trade debates in the Congress for different policies. And one of the things that I hear most frequently when I refer to the environment and health concerns that go to the horrible pollution I've seen in the Maquiladora and other areas is, well, Congressman, you just don't understand. There's a natural order to these things. And the natural order is that someday later, after the wealth has come to these developing nations, after they've been despoiled, they have to despoil. They say it's like the Industrial Revolution was in America or in Great Britain, that you have to first go through this phase of horrible despoliation, public health problems, and that. And then when you're rich enough, you can afford to have a decent environment. Could you comment on that, please, and help me?
Can you hear me? That's what's called the slow pitch down the middle. Obviously, if you destroy the environment and use that as a learning exercise, you may not have a whole lot left to apply your knowledge to in the next round. And obviously, we realize we have limited time, we have limited resources, we've got global warming going on, global threats and local threats to the environment on a tremendous and catastrophic level, and we don't have the time to wait decades to learn from mistakes that have already been made by the industrial nations. We can learn from these mistakes.
used to think that progress was about avoiding the mistakes of the past. Now we insist upon that you make them again. Interesting notion.
Ms. Herrera wants to
Yo creo que de aquí a que el tercer mundo llegue a tener las riquezas que dice la OMC, el tercer mundo, muchos de esos países ya no van a existir, tanto por los problemas económicos, por los del medio ambiente.
I think that instead of what the WTO is saying is that one day these riches will come to the developing world. What's going to happen is these countries are going to disappear, both because of the economic problems we have and the ecological problems that we have.
Thank you. We now have a moment for closing statements by members of the tribunal to comment on what they've heard here this morning, and we'll start with Congressman DeFazio, and we'll work this way across the table.
George, I want to go there.
Sure.
I've waited a long time for this day. Since I arrived in Congress, I've held a different view of trade. I fought NAFTA, GATT, Fast Track. And for a member of Congress from the Pacific Northwest, a Democrat, it's often been a long and lonely battle, but I got to tell you today, here, it is lonely no more. Thank you very much. We have heard some incredibly powerful testimony that will never be allowed before the WTO as it exists today. But before the WTO, or some changed International Trade Organization. This is the type of testimony and the issues that should be addressed day in and day out by the concerned peoples of the world and the governments of the world. These are the issues that should be addressed. When we were fighting over GATT, I had an interesting conversation with Mickey Cantor, at that time the President's Special Trade Representative, and I said, how can we have this organization where the decisions are made by secret tribunals with no conflict of interest rules, where non-governmental organizations, interveners, or even states or cities that have laws at risk are not allowed in the room? How can we have that sort of a system? And he said, well, you don't understand. He said, most of these countries we're dealing with, they don't believe in our system of jurisprudence and democracy, and this is what we had to have. I don't buy that for a minute. It was the U.S. corporations that drove this thing from the beginning. Renato Ruggiero, former Director General of the WTO, he's in Seattle. He's not here today. Are you here, Renato? No. Okay, well, I'll quote him since he's not here then. He said about the founding of the WTO that we were writing a constitution for a new world order. Now, the only thing Renato left out was that we were writing essentially a corporate Bill of Rights, a Bill of Rights that excluded human rights, labor rights, environmental rights, consumer rights. Well, I got news for Renato. The veil of secrecy has now been ripped aside, and people in this room, in Seattle, in Washington, around America, around the world are demanding a rewrite of that Constitution that includes those rights for all the people of the world.
Thank you so much. Well, as a Minister of Public Health in Belgium, I can announce to the public here that we also have a total ban on asbestos. And I remember the time where it was not the case. I remember that as an opposition member in '85, I had to attack my government because they did not want to introduce a total ban. And the reason was that at that moment, we still had a corporation producing asbestos. And that, of course, makes the link to the statement made by Mr. Castleman that in this particular situation, the United States are becoming very active because they do not have corporation producing it anymore. But I would like to draw the attention to the fact that this is the way things can work. And it's not because of the fact that a country has no economic interest anymore that we shouldn't use that fight in a positive direction. I would like to make the comparison with the landmine issue, where my own country, being absolutely tiny and small, played a crucial role. From the moment on, they did not produce landmines anymore, but thanks to the cooperation with many, many other countries, we got still a growing ban on landmines. So that's how things work in reality. And let's not be despiseful about opportunities that are created. But now coming back to the health issue, there is here in Seattle, in the 2 coming days, a big fight that will take place on the formulation of obstacles to trade. And in that context, there is a text saying that no country can be prohibited to take the measures necessary to protect health, life of people and animals, to protect environment, etc., to those levels the country considers these appropriate. And this is a fight that we will have. And therefore, my conviction is, let's do that fight. Let's not wait until something disappears, but let's do the fight so that the supremacy for the economic interests that is prevailing in the actual ruling system of WTO can be balanced by serious formulations, serious dispositions so that they can not get away with it. That's the way we have to defend ourselves, to defend our people, to defend our environment. And I would like to draw the attention to an initiative that is taken by several countries just in order to strengthen the defense possibilities of countries from the South. And it is the setting up of a law center which will be funded by international means so that poor countries can get access to the law center in order to defend themselves at the dispute panels, etc. If these things, these instruments, do not exist, where will they be? They will be in the middle of the desert. And therefore, I plead for pledging to that law center, to the technical assistance, so that developing countries get instruments to fight and to defend themselves.
I am very concerned about food safety. For many years now, we've been fighting against chemicals and pesticides and other potential harmful contaminants to our food. And I came here with this issue on my mind. As we walked up here today, a woman in the audience handed to Congressman Miller a piece of paper that I think basically identifies the concerns that I have and many of you, and I'd like to quickly ask our panel if what we have been handed by a woman who looked as if she was very serious about these issues, if this is reasonable. I want to read it to you very quickly.
You know that you are playing a very tough game, and that's what we have to do. Though parliaments have debated the statutes of WTO years ago, etc., it has not brought, at that time, the necessary reforms that are absolutely needed. And all the testimonies we have heard here today show that WTO, as it is functioning now, cannot go on. We have to stop it. I think it is our task to bring WTO back to the public domain, back to the people, so that the people can control it. And therefore, I want to change, to influence the statutes that are going to rule WTO tomorrow. And to end with one example that shows what really is going on is the example that was given by our friend from Pakistan, who highlighted very clearly the fact that many people in his country and in other countries do not have access to essential medicines. Well, happily enough, finally, I would say, and not even strongly enough, the World Health Organization has taken this up as its main campaign, and they are going to come here to Seattle to discuss with WTO about access to essential medicine. And that is a fight we have to do together.
I want to just make a few concluding remarks by way of saying how delightful it has been for me as a Canadian to be here, because, you know, sometimes we see what's happening, the current model of globalization, the regional agreements, the FTA, NAFTA, the WTO, the MAI, and there's a tendency in Canada to see all this, and not illegitimately, but nevertheless, it's nice to see exceptions, as the Americanization of the world, the Americanization of Canada, and it's nice to be in the company of Americans who think otherwise. those of us in Canada who consistently oppose these things, and I'm like my colleague here in the House of Representatives, I've been fighting these things for so long and have been on the margins and have lost so many battles that sometimes I get disoriented when I think we might be about to win one. And so I want to remind you that we did win one just recently for a variety of reasons. But I think the pendulum is swinging with the defeat of the MAI just not so long ago. And the obvious confusion in at the leadership level here in Seattle about whether they're going to be able to come out of this with anything like what they would like to see come out of it. I think we're on the beginning of a bit of a roll here. I want to be ever so hopeful because I've lost so many times. But I nevertheless want to be ever so hopeful and say how much hope that I have taken from this meeting. In Canada, sometimes when we oppose these things, we're called Canadian nationalists and anti-American, and I guess that makes all of you folks Canadian nationalists or anti-Americans. But what we are citizens of the world and people who say that we don't want a world run by and for the multinational corporations, no matter where they're stationed. We know that we all have to live together. We're not against globalization in principle, but we want globalization for people, sustainable globalization, globalization that has in mind the community, that has in mind the future of the human prospect, and not the short-term profit margins of the global corporations. I'm glad to be fighting alongside so many of you here, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you here this morning.
Congresswoman Maxine Waters.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to take a moment to thank the very wonderful panelists who came to be with us today to share with us their knowledge, their experience, and help to focus us on these most important issues dealing with WTO. Another big round of applause for all of our panelists. I'd like to thank the Sierra Club and the organizers of this great event today. It has been a wonderful couple of days that I've spent here in Seattle. Yesterday, I had the opportunity to be inspired by my friends in organized labor, the Steel Workers of America who are here. And last night, I attended a ceremony at a cathedral where we talked about Jubilee 2000 and getting rid of the world's debt and the debt of poor nations. I heard a liberation ceremony there last evening and a liberation sermon. I smell movement in the air. I'd like to take these few moments to send a message to the Director General of the WTO, Mr. Mike Moore, I believe his name is. I happened to see something in the news yesterday where he accused the NGOs and the activists who have come to Seattle of having ulterior motives, he said. He said we have a questionable agenda. My message to Mike Moore is this. Our motives and our agenda are very clear. We are openly discuss what we believe in, what we want to see, and our vision for this world. It is very simple. We want fair trade. We want clean, green, fair trade. We believe in democracy and democratic institutions. To Mr. Mike Moore, he needs to be reminded that we have been taught, we have been socialized, we have been reared on the idea that we can live in a democracy in this country and that we should spread democracy all over the world. And democratic institutions don't make decisions in secret with nameless and faceless people. We believe in the gains that we have made in organized labor. We have fought too hard for decent wages, benefits, safety in the workplace, and we're not going backwards. We believe in human rights and civil rights, and some of us have spent part of our career in Congress fighting against such things as favorite nation status for China. We believe and we respect the environment, and I guess we are guilty of wanting clean water. We want to breathe fresh air. We want to avoid soil contamination. We want to prevent the extinction of the birds, the fish, and the animals. We believe in family farmers, and guess what? Guess what? Despite the fact that I'm in this church, I just have to say, damn Chiquita bananas. I want to send a message that this movement can be and should be made up of people coming from the right, the left, the center, everywhere. This is about saving the earth. This is about protecting all human beings. I want to say to the Christian Coalition, if you really believe in family values, you've got to protect the right of people to work and earn a decent living. If you really want to make a case for the unborn, get rid of the pesticides that kill people in the fields and create deformities among the unborn. I want to say, if you don't believe in welfare, then let family farmers feed their families and not have to be on welfare. We have heard the issues here today. We've heard about asbestos and beef and gasoline additives and investment, intellectual property rights. We know what we must do. And in the final analysis, whether we're talking about Chiquita or that other great multinational corporation that's in your face every day on television with their multi-million-dollar ads telling you that they're feeding the world and that they are not only growing the crops, buying up all the crops, that they're processing them, they're putting them in the supermarkets, they're putting them on the table. Let me leave one last message for them. Damn ADM. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a reason this meeting's in church. ADM, right? Supermarket to the world. I thought it was Price Fixer to the world. I forget which it was. I forget. Price Fixer to the world. Well, let me again thank our panelists, this panel and the previous panel. The purpose of this morning's session was to put a human face on trade with respect to health and the environment and working conditions. I think that we successfully did that. I think as we all woke up this morning and read in the paper Mr. Moore's comments about our agenda,